Committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I should be astonished, but I'm not, that the chairman of the committee would quote from the discredited Durham Report and the discredited Mr. Durham, who filed, I think, a 300-page report giving his opinions, but whose two prosecutions both resulted in acquittals and jurors saying, why did we ever even have to take this? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to begin by saying that I condemn violence in all its forms, including threats, vandalism, and property destruction against any person or organization, regardless of their position on abortion rights. I would also like to reiterate my condemnation of the attempted murder of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. I'm grateful that law enforcement took Justice Kavanaugh's would-be assassin into custody before he could complete an act of violence. In a democracy, violence is never the answer in a political dispute, and it should be roundly and unreservedly condemned. Yet for decades, anti-abortion extremists have used violence, threats, and disruption to curb access to abortion. According to the National Abortion Federation, or NAF, since 1977, anti-abortion extremists have been responsible for 11 murders, 42 bombings, 200 arsons, 531 assaults, and thousands of incidents of criminal activities directed at patients, providers, and volunteers. Nearly 30 years ago, in response to this disruptive violence, including the murder of Dr. David Gunn, Congress passed the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. I've been unequivocal in my support for the FACE Act, as well as for the First Amendment rights of anti-abortion protesters, with whom I deeply disagree, so long as that speech does not cross the line into violent conduct or disruption. As a co-sponsor of the bill in 1993, which our former Judiciary Committee colleague and now Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer introduced in the House, I remarked on the floor that, quote, anti-abortion protesters have an absolute right to say don't do it or anything else they want to say. They do not have any right to say, by means of physical force or intimidation, we won't let you do it, close quote. Today's subcommittee hearing, however, is a lost opportunity to focus on the real, long-standing problem of violence and disruption that doctors, nurses, patients, and volunteers face in providing or accessing abortion, which appear to have spiked following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. Instead, the apparent purpose of today's hearing is to provide yet another platform for the majority's inflammatory, anti-federal law enforcement rhetoric, which I fear will only further contribute to a political climate where anti-abortion extremists believe their violent conduct is justified, particularly in states where abortion remains protected by law. According to NAF's latest report on the matter, in 2022, states that are protective of abortion rights saw a disproportionate increase in violence and disruption targeting doctors and their patients. This includes a 538% increase in obstructions, which NAF defines as causing a delay or attempting to cause a delay in the conduct of business or preventing people from entering or exiting an area, textbook examples of the conduct prohibited by the FACE Act. Despite this surge in incidents and the long history of violence and disruption perpetrated by anti-abortion extremists, which necessitated Congress to pass the FACE Act in the first place, today's hearing is designed to further the majority's misleading political narrative that the Biden administration is using federal law enforcement to target conservatives. There is zero evidence that federal prosecutors are selectively targeting anti-abortion protesters under the FACE Act. To the contrary, it appears that DOJ is enforcing the law without regard to defendants' viewpoints. At a recent bipartisan briefing provided to Judiciary Committee staff, FBI representatives stated that approximately 75% of FACE Act investigations concern incidents against anti-abortion facilities. Yet Republicans insist on devoting the subcommittee's time to this manufactured controversy to placate a minority of anti-abortion MAGA Republicans who would like this Congress to pass a total nationwide ban on abortion. Let me be clear. Democrats stand with the majority of the American public and will always oppose such a radical position. But regardless of your position on abortion rights, we must condemn all acts of violence, regardless of who is the ultimate target, and make clear that any individual who violates the FACE Act should be subject to prosecution. Unfortunately, by refusing to acknowledge the problem of violence against providers and patients and focusing only on this false narrative of malevolent federal law enforcement, today's hearing will inadvertently send the wrong message to anti-abortion extremists at a critical moment in our nation where reproductive freedom and abortion access is in crisis. This hearing is, in a sense, a repeat of a resolution we passed the first week of this session, the first week of Republicans' control of the House, when we passed the resolution condemning violence at anti-abortion facilities, pregnancy crisis centers, but rejected a Democratic amendment to add a condemnation of violence at abortion providers also. So they rejected an amendment. They said, we'll condemn violence against anti-abortion clinics, but we will not condemn, maybe say okay too, could not condemn violence at abortion clinics. Mr. Chairman, I believe today's hearing is a wasteful and ultimately irresponsible use of this subcommittee's time. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record in response to Mr.